When Clint Eastwood first met Olena Ivanova, she was just another exhausted worker in a small LA diner, cleaning tables and trying to survive. She had lost everything escaping the war in Ukraine: her home, her husband, the life she once knew. What she didn't expect was that a quiet stranger would change her fate forever. Because in true Clint Eastwood style, what started as a simple act of kindness became something much bigger, a life-changing moment that would inspire millions. And what he did next? It's a story that proves generosity can rewrite a person's destiny. The streets of Kyiv were unrecognizable. Smoke curled into the sky, thick and black, as distant explosions rattled the windows of every home. Air raid sirens howled, their piercing wails slicing through the bitter cold. Olena Ivanova clutched her children's hands, her knuckles white, her heartbeat a frantic drum against her ribs. She had spent 36 years in Ukraine, built a life within its borders. Now she was being forced to leave it all behind. Her husband, Serhiy, stood beside her at the train station. The platform was a sea of desperate faces, mothers cradling babies, elderly couples gripping each other's hands, families torn apart by impossible choices. "You have to go," Serhiy said, his voice steady despite the chaos. Olena shook her head. How could she leave him? The father of her children, the man who held her through every hardship, the man who now stood before her with a rifle slung across his chest instead of a wedding band on his finger. "We will see each other again," he whispered, pressing his forehead against hers. It wasn't a promise, it was a prayer. The train doors hissed open, and the crowd surged forward. Olena tightened her grip on her children, Sasha, 8, and Polina, 4, as they were nearly swallowed by the mass of bodies. "Mama, I'm scared," Sasha whispered, his fingers clutching her coat. "I know, my love," she murmured, lifting Polina onto her hip, "but we are together, and that is enough." Serhiy pressed a final kiss to Sasha's forehead, then Polina's. His eyes met Olena's one last time. "Go." The train lurched forward before the doors even shut. Through the grime-covered window, Olena saw Serhiy standing alone on the platform, smaller and smaller, until he was nothing but a blur. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had to be strong. As the train sped toward an uncertain future, Olena had no idea when, if ever, she would see home again. She just knew that for now, she had no choice but to keep moving. The Los Angeles air was warm, but it did nothing to melt the cold knot in Olena's stomach. She stood in front of the refugee shelter, a plain concrete building crowded with families like hers, displaced, exhausted, searching for something familiar in a foreign land. Her first night, she barely slept. Polina cried for her father in her sleep. Sasha curled into a ball, fists clenched, as if still bracing for an explosion that would never come. Olena lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had made a mistake. The shelter provided meals, but they were bland and unfamiliar. Canned beans, overcooked pasta, white bread with nothing to spread on it. Back home, she had cooked everything from scratch. Here, she felt like a beggar. She tried to find work, but who would hire a woman who barely spoke English? At the grocery store, she stared at the labels, her mind drowning in unfamiliar words. At a job interview for a cleaning position, the manager spoke too fast. She recognized only a few words: experience, documents, work permit, but the rest was lost. She left in silence, humiliated, empty-handed. Days passed. The savings she had managed to bring were gone. She could not go back. She could not move forward. One evening, as she sat on the shelter's front steps, she overheard two American women walking past. One laughed. The other shook her head. "It's sad, really," one of them said. "But what are we supposed to do? We can't save everyone." The words hit harder than any bomb. Tears welled up in Olena's eyes, but she swallowed them down. She had survived war. She had survived hunger. She would survive this, because she had to. The bright Help Wanted sign flickered in the window of Tony's Diner, a small, family-owned restaurant in downtown Los Angeles. Olena hesitated before pushing the door open. She had lost count of how many places she had asked for work. Each rejection had been another wound, another reminder that she was a stranger in this country. Behind the counter, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair wiped down a coffee machine. His name tag read, Tony. "You need something, miss?" he asked, not unkindly. Olena swallowed. Words in English did not come easily. "I need work," she said slowly, forcing each syllable. "I clean." Tony glanced at her tired eyes, at the way she held her hands, palms up, as if offering proof of how hard they could work. He sighed. "You got experience?" Olena nodded too quickly. Experience? She had worked her entire life, cooking, cleaning, caring for her children, but none of it was written on a resume. Tony studied her for a long moment. Then he exhaled. "Mop's in the back, pays low, but it's cash." Relief flooded through Olena's chest. It wasn't much, but it was something. For the next 2 weeks, she scrubbed greasy tables, wiped down counters, and mopped floors long after the last customer had left. Her feet ached, her hands blistered, but she never complained. One evening, as she cleared a table near the window, the bell above the door jingled. A tall, elderly man stepped inside, his cowboy hat tilted slightly forward. His stride was slow but steady, his presence commanding without trying to be. The air in the diner shifted. A few customers glanced up. Some whispered. Olena felt it too, but she didn't dare look up. She didn't need to. She knew that face. Clint Eastwood. Her hands trembled as she wiped the table. She had seen his movies in Ukraine. He was a legend, a giant. But here, in this tiny diner, he was just another customer looking for a meal. Olena kept her head down. Famous or not, he was not here for her. She had a job to do. Olena moved from table to table, her damp rag brushing over each surface in quick, practiced motions. The diner buzzed with quiet conversation, the clatter of dishes, and the faint hum of an old radio in the background. She worked as if she was invisible. It was easier that way. But she was not invisible to him. Clint Eastwood sat at a corner booth, sipping black coffee. His plate, barely touched, sat in front of him. He was watching her, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, not in the way men sometimes did when they thought a woman was too tired or too poor to object. This was different. It was curiosity, maybe even recognition. Olena kept moving. Do not make trouble. Do not get noticed. But as she reached for a plate at the next table, her hand slipped. The plate tumbled toward the floor. She gasped. A hand shot out, fast, steady, and caught it, mid-air. Olena froze. Clint Eastwood held the plate in one hand, his fingers wrapped around the edge with effortless control. He set it gently back on the table, his blue eyes locking onto hers. "Quick hands," he said, his voice low, calm. "But you're shaking." She swallowed hard. Her English was not good, but she understood enough. "Sorry," she whispered. He tilted his head slightly, studying her. "You're not from around here." It wasn't a question. Olena hesitated, then nodded. "Ukraine." For the first time, his expression changed. The cowboy hat cast a shadow over his face, but she saw it, a flicker of something deep in his eyes, something that wasn't just politeness, it was understanding. He gestured toward the seat across from him. "Sit." Olena's breath caught. She glanced toward the counter. Tony had stepped into the kitchen. No one was watching. She hesitated. Then slowly, she sat down. For the first time in weeks, someone wanted to hear her story. The diner hummed with quiet conversation, but at that small corner booth, time seemed to slow. Clint Eastwood sat across from Olena, his coffee growing cold, his gaze steady. "Ukraine." He repeated the word like it carried weight in his mouth. "You came here alone?" Olena hesitated. She did not like talking about herself. not because she was ashamed, because she was tired. Tired of explaining, tired of pity, tired of trying to make people understand the kind of loss that could never be put into words. Still, there was something about the way he asked, the way he waited, that made her answer. "Not alone?" Her voice was quiet. "With my children, but no husband." Eastwood nodded, slow, understanding. "He stayed to fight?" Olena's throat tightened. She nodded. For a moment, Clint Eastwood said nothing. He just sat there, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of his cup. Then he spoke, not about war, not about politics, but about struggle. He told her about his parents, how they barely scraped by during the Great Depression, how his father, a steel worker, lost his job and moved the family from town to town, searching for anything that would put food on the table. He told her about his own past, how he once had nothing. Before the movies, before the fame, before Hollywood turned him into a legend, he had worked as a lumberjack, a steel worker, even a dishwasher, just like her. "You don't forget those years," he said, his voice quieter now. "You don't forget what it's like to have your hands blistered, your back aching, and still wondering if it'll be enough." Olena listened, not because he was famous, but because he understood. He didn't pretend to know what war was like, but he knew what it meant to fight for something bigger than yourself. Then, as he stood up, he reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. No big gestures, no words, just a quiet movement, barely noticeable. He slid it across the table with one rough, calloused hand. "Take care of yourself." And with that, Clint Eastwood walked out of the diner, his hat pulled low, disappearing into the night. For a long time, Olena just stared at the envelope. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. She had seen enough in this life to know what it usually meant when a man left an envelope on the table. It was a tip, maybe $20, maybe $50, if he was generous. She swallowed hard, opened it. Her breath caught. Inside was a check for $10,000. Her hands shook so hard, she almost dropped it. She stared at the number, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. It had to be a mistake. It couldn't be real. Then she saw the note. A small piece of folded paper, simple, unassuming. She opened it. "This is just the beginning. Call this number." There was no name, no explanation, just a phone number scrawled in steady, deliberate handwriting. Olena's heart pounded. She looked around the diner, as if expecting Clint Eastwood to walk back in to tell her this was a joke. But he was gone. She pressed the note to her chest, her eyes burning with something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. For the first time since she fled Ukraine, she wasn't just surviving. She had a reason to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. Olena sat on the edge of the small cot in the refugee shelter, the envelope still clutched in her hands. The weight of it felt impossible. $10,000, more than she had ever held in her life, more than she knew what to do with. And then there was the note. Her fingers traced the phone number, her mind swirling with doubt. What if this was a mistake? What if she called, and someone on the other end laughed, told her it wasn't meant for her? Or worse, what if it was real? She swallowed hard. She had nothing left to lose. With shaky hands, she picked up the shelter's old landline phone and dialed. One ring, then two, then... Malpaso Productions. A crisp, professional voice answered. Olena almost hung up. She forced herself to speak. I was given this number." Her voice was uncertain, thick with her accent. "By Clint Eastwood." A pause, then the voice softened. "You must be Olena." She squeezed her eyes shut. This was real. "Yes?" The woman on the phone introduced herself as Maggie, Eastwood's personal assistant. She was warm, patient, like she already knew everything. "Mr. Eastwood would like to meet with you," Maggie said. "Would you be able to come to his office?" Olena's breath caught in her throat. His office? She was just a refugee. a woman who cleaned tables for a few dollars an hour. What could a man like Clint Eastwood possibly want with her? Still, she heard herself say yes. Maggie gave her the address, a building in Burbank, and assured her that transportation would be arranged. Olena placed the phone back on the receiver. Her hands were still shaking. She had crossed a border to escape war. But now, sitting in this tiny, overcrowded shelter, she felt like she was standing at the edge of something even bigger. For the first time in a long time, she felt hope. The black SUV pulled up in front of a glass office building in Burbank, the name Malpaso Productions shining in clean silver lettering. Olena stepped out, clutching her coat tightly around her. The driver led her through the entrance, past walls lined with movie posters, Dirty Harry, $1 Million Baby, Unforgiven. She had seen some of them long before the war. Now she was here, walking through a world that felt impossible. Then a familiar voice. "You made it." She turned. Clint Eastwood stood there just as steady, just as composed as the night she met him in the diner. But this time, he wasn't just another customer. He was a man with a purpose. He motioned for her to follow. They walked into his office, a simple, wood-paneled space. No unnecessary luxury, just books, scripts, and photos from decades of film. He gestured for her to sit. "I didn't help you out of pity," he said, getting straight to the point. "I helped you because I see something in you." Olena blinked. "I don't understand." Clint leaned forward. "Your story, your strength? I think the world needs to hear it." She shook her head. "I am not special." His expression didn't change. "You are." He explained his plan. He wasn't just offering money. He was offering her a new start, a job, working with his foundation, one that helped refugees, war veterans, and displaced families. A home, something permanent for her and her children, and something bigger, a chance to tell her story. "People forget what war does to families," he said, "but you can remind them." Olena's chest tightened. No one had ever looked at her like this, not as a victim, but as someone who mattered. Tears stung her eyes. She had lost everything, but somehow, against all odds, she had found herself here. And for the first time, she wasn't just surviving, she was beginning again. The first time Olena stood behind a microphone, her hands shook. She looked out over the crowd of faces, some familiar, some strangers. People who had come to listen, to understand, to see her. A year ago, she had been cleaning tables in a diner, unseen, unheard. Now she stood before a packed auditorium, a guest speaker at an event, raising money for war refugees. She took a deep breath. "My name is Olena Ivanova. I am from Ukraine, and I lost everything." The silence in the room grew heavier. She told them about the bombs over Kyiv, the train station filled with desperate families, the moment she had to walk away from her husband, knowing she might never see him again. She spoke about arriving in America with nothing, how she had felt invisible, hopeless, lost. And then she spoke about Clint Eastwood, how one man's kindness had given her a new beginning, how that kindness had reminded her that she was more than just a refugee, she was a survivor. "I am standing here today not because I am lucky," she said, her voice steady. "I am standing here because someone believed in me, and now I want to believe in others." The crowd erupted into applause. The event was just the beginning. Word spread. News stations started calling, first local, then national. Soon, Olena was being invited onto morning shows, podcasts, even live interviews. They asked about her story, but she never made it about herself. "There are thousands like me," she told one journalist. "People who have lost everything, people who need help. I cannot save them all, but I can make sure the world does not forget them." The more she spoke, the stronger her voice became. The world was listening, and so was Clint Eastwood. The email arrived late at night. A message from Maggie, Clint's assistant. "Mr. Eastwood wants to meet. There's something he wants to discuss with you." Olena's pulse quickened. What now? She had barely stepped into her new life, and already the ground beneath her was shifting again. The next morning, she arrived at Malpaso Productions. Clint was waiting for her. No small talk, no pleasantries. He got right to the point. I want to make a film. Olena blinked. A film? A documentary, he clarified, about war survivors, about people like you. She stared at him. This couldn't be real. Clint leaned forward, resting his forearms on his desk. The world needs to see what war does, not just the battles, not just the politics, but the people, the ones who carry the weight long after the bombs stop falling. Olena swallowed hard. He wanted her to be the narrator, to be the voice that told these stories, not just hers, others, refugees, soldiers, mothers, children, people who had fled war zones, people who had been displaced, abandoned, forgotten. Clint Eastwood was giving them a platform. Her hands trembled. Why me? His expression was calm, steady, because you lived it. The production began immediately. Olena traveled across the U.S., meeting families from Syria, Afghanistan, Sudan, Ukraine, each one with a story that mirrored hers. Some had rebuilt their lives. Others were still searching for a way forward. Through it all, the camera followed. Olena's voice became the thread that tied their stories together. Raw, honest, unfiltered. And people noticed. News outlets picked up on the project. Social media exploded. Clint Eastwood's documentary was becoming something bigger than just a film. It was a movement, and Olena was at the heart of it. The ballroom was filled with powerful people, corporate executives, philanthropists, celebrities, politicians. They sat at round tables covered in white linen, sipping wine from crystal glasses. At the center of the stage, Olena stood behind the podium, hands clasped tightly. She wasn't supposed to be here. Just a year ago, she had cleaned tables at a diner, barely surviving. Now she was speaking at one of the largest humanitarian fundraisers in the world. She took a deep breath, then began. Millions of Ukrainians have lost everything. Some have lost their homes. Some have lost their families. Some have lost their lives. And the world cannot afford to forget them. The room fell silent. She told them about the families she had met during the making of the documentary. Mothers forced to flee with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Children who didn't understand why their fathers never came home. Elderly couples who had to start over in a country where they didn't speak the language. I was one of them. She saw people shift uncomfortably. This wasn't just statistics, it was real. Then she looked straight at the crowd and said, "But I was given a second chance, and now I am here to fight for those who haven't had one." The applause was thunderous. By the end of the night, millions were raised for refugee aid programs, and this was only the beginning. Olena's voice was no longer just in the documentary. She was meeting with world leaders, speaking at global summits, sitting in rooms with people who had the power to change things. At the White House, she met the president. In Geneva, she stood before the United Nations, demanding action for displaced families. She wasn't just a refugee anymore. She was an advocate, a fighter, a symbol of resilience, and through it all, her children were watching. Sasha, now 9, played soccer in the backyard of their new home in California. Polina, 5, giggled as she read English words from a picture book. They no longer woke up crying from nightmares. They were no longer afraid. They were home. And for Olena, that was the greatest victory of all. The red carpet stretched before her, glowing under the flashing lights of photographers, cameras, reporters, shouting voices. Olena had never imagined herself in a place like this, but here she was, walking beside Clint Eastwood at the Oscars. The documentary had changed everything. It had shaken the world, sparking conversations about war, displacement, and resilience. And Hollywood had taken notice. Producers and directors had reached out saying the same thing. This isn't just a documentary. This is a story that needs to be told on the big screen. A major studio had optioned the rights to her life story. A feature film was in development, and now she was here, invited as a guest of honor. The cameras clicked furiously as she stepped onto the carpet. A reporter rushed up, microphone in hand. "Olena, how does it feel to go from refugee to Oscar guest?" She paused, thinking. A year ago, she had felt invisible. Now the world was watching. She smiled softly. "It is not about me," she said. "It is about the people who still need help. If this night helps them be seen, then it is worth everything." She walked forward, the crowd parting before her. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear her name being called. Not in desperation, not in fear, but in recognition. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a story the world would never forget. The plane touched down with a gentle thud. Olena's breath caught in her throat as she looked out the window. Kyiv. It had been years since she fled, years since the night she boarded that crowded train with her children, leaving behind a husband, a home, a life she thought she would never see again. Now, she was back. But it was not the same Ukraine she had left. As she stepped off the plane, she saw it in the cracks in the pavement, the buildings still scarred by war. But she also saw it in the people, resilient, unbroken, rebuilding. Hope was in the air. The drive through the city was a blur of emotions. The streets she once knew had changed. Some places were gone forever. Others had been rebuilt. Then they reached it, her old neighborhood. She stepped out of the car, her legs shaking beneath her. Her childhood apartment building still stood, but the windows were shattered. The walls bore the marks of bomb blasts. And yet, somehow, it was still home. A lump formed in her throat as she walked forward, taking it all in. The ghosts of the past whispered around her. Then, a voice. "Olena!" She turned, and there he was. Serhiy, her husband, the man she had left on the train platform all those years ago. Her breath caught. For so long, she had prepared herself for the worst, for the possibility that she might never see him again. But he was here, alive. The moment their eyes met, the years apart melted away. She ran to him. Serhiy caught her in his arms, holding her like he never wanted to let go. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to, because in that moment, nothing else mattered. The day before she was set to leave Ukraine, Olena's phone rang. She recognized the number immediately. "Clint," she answered, her voice soft. "Hello?" His voice, steady as ever, came through the line. "I hear you made it back." She smiled, looking out over the Kyiv skyline. "Yes, it's different, but it's still home." A pause. Then he said something that sent a lump to her throat. "Your story is bigger than any movie, Olena." Her fingers tightened around the phone. "Keep telling it." Her eyes burned with unshed tears. Even after all these years, he still believed in her. Then his voice softened. "I have one last thing to tell you." She frowned. "What is it?" Another pause. Then, "Check your email." She pulled out her laptop, her hands trembling as she clicked into her inbox, and then she saw it. A donation from Clint Eastwood, millions to refugee support programs, in her name. Her breath hitched. "Clint, this is too much." He chuckled softly. "Not enough, if you ask me." Tears slipped down her cheeks. She had no words. For a moment, there was silence between them. Then Clint spoke one last time. "You keep going, Olena. You keep fighting. And never forget, sometimes one person's story can change the world." The call ended. She stared at the screen, the weight of his final gift sinking in. And in that moment, she knew exactly what she had to do. She would keep fighting. She would keep telling the stories of those who had been forgotten. Because Clint was right. Some stories were bigger than movies, and hers was just beginning. Years passed. Olena Ivanova was no longer just a refugee, no longer just a survivor. She had become something more, an advocate, a voice, a force for change. She traveled across the world, speaking at conferences, meeting with world leaders, activists, and refugees who had been forced to start over. She told their stories just as Clint had told her to. Her foundation, the Ivanova Initiative, provided housing, education, and job training for displaced families. It had started small, but with Clint Eastwood's donation, it became something bigger than she ever imagined. Because of him, thousands of refugees found homes. Because of him, children who had lost everything were given a second chance. Because of one man's kindness, a movement was born, and Olena never forgot that. She often thought of the night in the diner, when she was invisible, when the world had looked right past her. Clint Eastwood hadn't, and because of that, she would never look past anyone else. Her children grew up in a home filled with love, strength, and resilience. Sasha, once a scared boy clinging to his mother's coat, became a young man determined to make a difference. He studied international law, vowing to fight for displaced people like his mother once was. Polina, who had cried for her father every night in the shelter, became an artist. Her paintings captured the pain, the loss, but also the hope of those who had endured war. Their mother's journey had shaped them. They grew up knowing that life could take everything away in an instant, but that one person's kindness could rebuild it all. One evening, long after her children had gone to bed, Olena sat on her porch looking up at the sky. Her phone buzzed. It was an old news article resurfaced online. Clint Eastwood's final donation to refugee families. She smiled softly, running a hand over the worn-out leather journal she always carried, filled with the names, the faces, the stories of the people she had met. She had kept her promise. She had kept telling the story. Because Clint had been right. Some stories are bigger than movies, and sometimes one act of generosity can change everything. Want to hear more of this? Then click on the video on the right-hand side, which is even crazier.